Welcome everyone to theScore Fantasy Football Podcast presented by Subway. I'm your host, Justin Boone, the lead fantasy analyst at theScore. Joining me today is my co-host, David P. Woods, a man who apparently spent his teen years in a backyard wrestling federation. I'm bringing this up for two reasons. One, our guest today is Jake Ciely of The Athletic, and I think Jake's going to get a kick out of this. Second is that this is another item that came directly from your wife. She suggested that it get brought up on the podcast. She said that you even sold tapes of matches online, and some people actually bought them, apparently. Woods, this can't be true. Come on.
It's true. You're really digging deep into the embarrassing stories archive here. We jumped off ladders and through tables and stuff like that, and we filmed it all and edited it together, and we sold some of them, and it's all on YouTube, but I'm not going to tell you what to search for to find it. I don't think anyone will ever find it, hopefully.
I don't even know what to say about that one. The more I find out about you, the stranger your story becomes. On today's episode, I'm going to run through a couple of the updates that you're going to see in my rankings on Thursday. Then we're going to preview Week 5 with, as I mentioned, our guest, Jake Ciely. Jake and I were on a weekly fantasy TV show last year, so it's going to be great to catch up with him. I haven't talked to him too much since then. And then we're going to go over some players that we think are going to lead you to a fantasy title in the second half of the season, so make sure you stick around for that. But first, my updated rankings are going to be available on theScore on Thursday. Let's take a first look at some of the notable risers and fallers that you're going to see in our Next Level Update segment, which is presented by our friends at Subway, who upped the taste ante with their new Next Level Paninis. The first is Aaron Jones. Surprise, surprise. We love him here. We've talked about him so much. I'm moving Mr. Jones up 7 spots to RB22. The Lions defense has been destroyed on the ground. They've given up 300-yard rushing games in 4 weeks, and they just allowed 240 yards from scrimmage to Ezekiel Elliott. Jones's workload isn't totally secure yet, but we're starting to see him come on, and technically he's still part of that. Still part of that 3-man committee, but I trust him more than the other guys that I've moved him over. Lamar Miller, Alex Collins. Jones is actually playing against another back that in my rankings that I'm moving down. I'm sending Kerryon Johnson in the opposite direction. Woods, you're going to have to try to hold back the tears there. I know you love Kerryon. He's looked phenomenal when he's been given the ball. But Matt Patricia says that he's happy with the amount of touches that Kerryon has right now. A little worried that they're not going to continue to up his usage. That's what we really need to see from him. After running for that first 100-yard game in forever for the Lions, they just gave him 9 carries the week after. Very disappointing. To make matters worse, the Packers have been solid against the run, and with Adrian Peterson, he's really the lone running back that has done well against the Packers this year. So I'm moving Kerryon down. Who else do we have here? Will Fuller is falling in the ranks. I have legitimate concerns about Fuller's hamstring injury. I think it might keep him out this week. As of now, we haven't heard his status, but I moved him down to wide receiver 35, and I would plan to have another option ready in case he can't go. That might be his teammate, Keke Coutee, but we will talk about him a little more later. If you want to see the rest of my rankings, the full update, including these changes, will be available on Thursday on theScore. Speaking of rankings, though, we have another one of the top rankers in the industry with us today, Jake Ciely, senior writer at The Athletic, the all-in kid himself. You can find him on Twitter at allinkid. Jake, we have messaged back and forth. I mentioned the TV show we were on before. It's great to finally talk to you. I missed those weekly conversations on the Rankings Reveal show. How you been doing?
I've been doing good. Yeah, that was a good time that we used to have together. So, now we have to do the rankings on our own, but it sounds like you kind of might have checked mine. Maybe you checked the link, because I had the same thing with the Aaron Jones and Kerryon Johnson. Those are actually people came after me that, why do you have Kerryon so low?
Well, there are 2 players that we have talked up a lot here, and I think we would love to see Kerryon get some more work, but yeah, we're not so sure it's going to happen.
It's coming.
Just yet.
It's coming for him.
It should.
Be patient.
It should. Common sense will
Why?
prevail
Is Patricia
eventually.
not going to call the plays anymore. Well, not that he calls the plays, but he's not going to control the play,
Not
control
gonna be
Jim Bob
involved
Cooter
as
because he's
much.
getting enough touches according to Patricia.
Yeah, I know he said that. I just think you can only go so long denying the undeniable. Carry on breakout is coming at some point here. I mean, the breakout might be he gets more than 9 carries in a game. Let's set our expectations at a realistic level. But can we get him 12, 15 at some point here? Come on.
Let's hope. Well, let's talk about some of the running back situations around the league, because looking at the Bills defense, we've seen running backs go off against them almost every week, aside from that crazy blowout against the Vikings, but we won't even talk about that. That was just a strange aberration. I think they're very, very vulnerable on the ground. This week they get the Titans, who started to find their groove on offense. It was mostly the passing game that got going last week, but that's a good sign for them as a whole if Mariota's playing a little bit better and if he's healthy. Jake, who do you think is going to benefit most in this backfield here? Are we going to see Dion Lewis put up a big game? Are we going to see Derrick Henry finally do something? Or, is everyone on the Titans going to have a good game against the Bills, like 3 of the 4 teams they've faced so far?
No, actually, Corey Davis is down in my rankings because he's getting Tre'Davious White, and that's turning into one of the matchups where you want to avoid it as much as possible. He shut down basically everybody. He's the reason Stephon Diggs did nothing. If you look at everything that he's done so far this year, the only big play was last week. It was Ty Montgomery on a play with most of the yards. I think it was like 30-something yards out of the 43-yard catch out of the backfield, and it's after the catch. And they attributed that to White, even though, you can understand the point before that is he didn't even have 10 completions and targets headed. The Chargers didn't even throw his way at all. So I'm just saying Corey Davis would be the one I'm out on. If Derrick Henry doesn't get going this week, I think now it's full-on panic, potentially even drop him mode, because this is the matchup for him. This is the matchup to get on track and be what everybody who drafted him wanted to be. Fortunately, I own no shares because I was one of the biggest haters in the world. But Dion Lewis should have a good game. And I'm less concerned about Dion Lewis. Like you said, the situation before, a little bit different, but Dion Lewis should be fine as he is most weeks. But I'm looking for Derrick Henry to get on track, even though Josh Allen's at quarterback. Even though you look at everything in front of us, I would say, the Josh Allen on quarterback, because of the pace of play is what I'm talking about for the other side. Because Tennessee could get up because of Josh Allen. Tennessee could be up by halftime and running out the clock like most teams outside of the Vikings have done against the Bills, and that's why you want Derrick Henry this week.
And Woods, I know you own Henry in at least one league. This has to be the week for him, right?
If it's not, like Jake said, it's all over then. The Bills have allowed 7 rushing touchdowns through the first 4 weeks, and this sets up as a perfect script for Derrick Henry. The Titans, surely they want to get him going. They finally have their offensive tackles back. They're going to want to maybe establish a bit of a rushing attack there. Marcus Mariota, we still don't think is perfectly healthy, so it makes sense that they should run the ball in this game when controlling the lead, but also to get the lead. And if we look at their breakdown of carries so far, the Titans are giving more to Henry when they're controlling the games, and when they're trailing, trying to get back into it, they're giving a little bit more to Lewis, which is exactly what you'd expect based on their skill sets. We figure they're going to control this game. So I think probably a large workload coming for Henry, and I do expect him to put up a decent game. It may be the only decent game he has all season. And if we don't finally see that game from him, then yeah, it's definitely all over there.
Both Lewis and Henry have been kind of disappointing so far from a fantasy standpoint. The same can be said for Kenyan Drake. And I mentioned this on our Sunday recap show, but over the last 2 weeks, Drake has 8 carries for 6 yards and 3 catches for 20 yards. That is all. His Week 5 matchup is with the Bengals. They're giving up the 12 most fantasy points to opposing running backs, so maybe some signs of hope. They've only really given up one big game, though, and that was to Christian McCaffrey at 184 yards against them. Jake, do you see any chance of Drake turning things around?
I don't think it's Drake. It's the use. What can we do? We can't force the hand of the team, and we all joked about it heading to the season and made the Seinfeld reference of hating the Drake, and we all know that this is going to be an issue, but we also all hope that talent would win out and that Drake himself would force the issue in the opposite direction. And he wasn't half bad the first 2 weeks. He even had the touchdown. It wasn't anything more than I think was it 14 was his high end carries. It was still, he didn't even get past 15 in the first 2 weeks, but he had a few receptions chipped in, so you felt okay in a PPR especially. But the past 2 weeks is damning. There's no other way to put it. He can Gase insist on going to Frank Gore. It's a matchup that can be exploited. But to your point, as you just said, it's kind of overweighted by one specific game more than the cross of all 4 games the Bengals have played. I got to say, if he does anything this week, I'm immediately selling him. I hope he gets on track, but I'm immediately selling him if I happen to own him because whatever Adam Gase is doing, they don't want to use him.
And to loop back, that might be the same situation with Derrick Henry. If he has a big game this week against the Bills in that matchup, you probably want to test the water out there.
Well, like I said, you should have never drafted Derrick Henry in the first place.
Well, perhaps that's also true. Let's go over another backfield that has been just absolutely frustrating for fantasy owners to get a handle on. The Seahawks had Chris Carson and Mike Davis both play pretty well in starting roles last year at different times. Then they decide to draft Rashad Penny in the first round. Carson outshines Penny in the offseason and in the preseason. Penny gets hurt, but ends up coming back at the beginning of the year. You know, they kind of had a really awful timeshare to start the season. Finally, Pete Carroll decides to give Carson a big workload, and he responds. He has a big game. We expected Carson to play last week. All signs pointed that Carson was going to play, and then he was ruled inactive a couple hours before the game. We figured that was going to be Penny's chance now. It was going to finally be his shot to take control of that backfield, and then Mike Davis steps in, and he has a big game. You know, laying all that out, it makes it seem even more insane that they took Penny in the first round, obviously. But, Jake, what are people supposed to do with this backfield now? Carson might be back this week. It seems like he's going to be back. Pete Carroll's suggesting that Davis is going to have a role regardless now. Is this just going to go back to another awful timeshare?
I think it's something to definitely avoid. If Carson has a good game and you happen to own Carson, there's another one. You sell if you can, because it's not even the fact that you want to talk about talent between the three of them, because if he didn't get hurt and put on the weight, which was his own fault that he even had that happen, talking about Penny, is he still has the most. There's a reason they drafted him in the first round. He's the most talented player in this backfield. Chris Carson is a nice running back. He's not of his level, even in that huge game. It took him 32 carries to get there at a very mediocre 3-point and change yards per carry. He's a good, not great running back. Same thing with Mike Davis. And I was a Mike Davis fan coming out of college, but he's limited in his own right. If we're just talking talent, as in the three running backs, it is Penny. But at the same time, we kind of heard during the draft that Pete Carroll wasn't fond of the Penny pick. And Pete Carroll is also you-know-what crazy. Like, he says one thing that can completely contradicts every other report coming from the team, says something he's going to do something, then doesn't do it. Sometimes he says he's going to do something and actually, the guy's lost it. I don't know what's up going on inside that brain, but it wouldn't surprise me if Carson gets 30 carries this week. It wouldn't surprise me if Mike Davis gets 30 carries this week. And it honestly still wouldn't surprise me if 1 week he all of a sudden decides it's going to be Penny time, because the fact is you didn't know that Chris Carson was being used in special teams and then he wasn't being used and he was not tired and all that. To me, you don't deserve to be a head coach if you don't know what's going on with your players. So you need to know that. I kind of gave him a pass for that and thought he was just making an excuse, but whatever it might be, I want nothing to do with this backfield at this point.
All right, sounds like Jake's getting a little fired up here. So let's talk about a backfield that's actually doing well, and that's the Broncos' backs. We've seen good things from them. Phillip Lindsay went undrafted. Royce Freeman was a third rounder. I mean, that points out even how silly it was that they took Penny in the first round. But anyway, Lindsay currently a RB17 in standard, RB23 in PPR. Freeman's RB21 in standard, RB28 in PPR. Lindsay's gone over 70 yards from scrimmage in 3 of his 4 outings. The 4th game was the one where he was ejected in the first half for punching someone. Freeman's found the end zone the last 3 games. Hasn't really matched Lindsay in the yardage department, but he is getting into the end zone. Does the matchup with the Jets, Jake, does it set up as a Lindsay game? Does it set up as a Freeman game? Or at this point, would you feel confident just starting either of these guys?
I would say it's not really any game going forward. It's just, this is the what you expected Derrick Henry and Dion Lewis to be situation. And that's what I said in the preseason, because if you looked at it, and the comparison I kept making with Lindsay is everybody's talking about his size and talking about all this. Well, if you look back and put his measurables against somebody else, specifically his height and weight, he's Danny Woodhead. Danny Woodhead, as you well know, as everybody well knows, was not only a rock-solid RB2 in PPR, he was fringe rock-solid RB1 2 years. So 2 of those good years that he had. So you're looking at this as you can use both. This is what we wanted from the Titans. This is what, you know what, Derrick Henry, that's fine. He'll have greater value when he gets a touchdown, but more often than not, his floor will be enough in a non-PPR to be an RB2. That's what we want with Royce Freeman, and that's what we're getting with Royce Freeman. Henry's not doing it. Freeman is. Lindsay's doing just as good, if not better, at times than Dion Lewis. So this is basically what we expected the Titans to be, which means, to answer the beginning of your question, is you just roll them out there every single week. Yes, some matchups are going to point to a passing game more, but you're looking at their use every single week, and so far it hasn't been too skewed by the game flow.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. It's hard to find even which game flow would benefit either guy, because if you look at the breakdown of touches there, they're sort of using each guy the same when they have the lead. It's not like Freeman's out there grinding clock late in the game,
right,
and Lindsay's the clear receiving back. And then you sort of look at this one, you're like, well, Jets, that looks like a juicy matchup. Maybe they'll control the game. But no, the Jets are a slight betting favorite in this one. So this week of all, I don't see any reason to believe in one over the other. You kind of just got to roll them out and expect the same thing we've been getting all along.
All right, we're all on the same page there. Enough about the running backs, though. Let's shift over to wide receivers. There was talk after last Thursday that the Rams trio of Brandon Cooks and Cooper Kupp and Robert Woods was the best trio the team had ever had. I don't agree with that sentiment, but they are pretty damn talented, and they're killing it for fantasy owners this year for sure. Jake, every week you and I have to figure out what order to rank these guys in. Normally I have Cooks the highest given his upside, big playability, but Kupp and Woods are not far behind at this point. How do you have these guys ranked this week against the Seahawks?
What's funny is you're putting me on the spot here is because the past 2 weeks I've actually called the top wide receiver for 2 weeks ago. I said it was going to be Woods. Last week I said it's Kupp. So now,
so then you should have this.
I should have it. You should make it. Well, guess what? It's going to be the one I haven't used yet. I actually have Brandon Cooks the highest of this because honestly, this entire Seattle Seahawks secondary is one to abuse here. And if you look at the situation, I have Cooks, Kupp, and Woods in order, and they're all inside my top 16. So you can't go wrong. You just start all of them. It doesn't matter. This is kind of similar to what we were just talking about the running backs for the Broncos. Just start them. You're going to get a good game, and they've all got good floors. But if I had to pick one this week, it's Brandon Cook's turn. Not that he didn't have a great game last week, but it's his turn to lead.
It's a much less exciting receiving core, but the Jaguars have 3 receivers of their own who have had some success, just not at the same time this season. It seems like one of them seems to pop off, maybe 2 if you're lucky. This week, they're on the road. It's a potential shootout with the Chiefs. The Jags aren't going to be able to just grind clock. We assume they're not going to be able to. The game is a 49-point Vegas total. It's extremely high for a Jaguars game. Keelan Cole, Dede Westbrook, Dante Moncrief. Which of the Jags receivers do you want to play this week? Or are you maybe staying away just because of Blake Bortles there?
No, it's in that order. I think Bortles could be actually a serviceable quarterback this week if you happen to have somebody on a bye or maybe you've been struggling with your options so far this year, because Blake Bortles, for fantasy purposes, is good more often than not. And if you look at this matchup, as you said, the Jaguars defense Jaguar defense isn't invulnerable. Like they were exploited at times last year. Let's not paint a picture where not saying you are, but people out there, like, all 16 games weren't shutdowns. So Patrick Mahomes and this offense can certainly do enough damage against them where the Jaguars offense has to step up to stay with them. And in that case, you gave the order I would go in. I would go Cole, Westbrook, and Moncrief, but it's not the Rams. This is like the poor version. Actually, this is like this poor on welfare, and it's worse than that. I don't know what's worse than whatever. Anyway, that's what the version they are. And I don't really want to start any of them because it's only going to usually be one person that's valuable, and that's what you're trying to pick. So I would go Cole and just ride him and just, understand you're going to get some bad games, understand you're going to get some good games. That's who Cole is. And that's where I would go first. And then Westbrook would be second.
And I agree. Sticking in the AFC South, we saw Keke Coutee. I mentioned him earlier. We saw him have a 100-yard game in his NFL debut last week. That was helped along by the fact that Fuller was dealing with that hamstring injury, but we don't really know what Fuller's status is, as I mentioned earlier. Coutee played well, but I think the bigger thing was they were actually scheming ways to get the ball to him. That was exciting to see. It definitely means they want to get him involved here. At the time we're recording, as I mentioned, we don't know for sure if Fuller is going to be active or not. That might come out in the next day or two here. But regardless, Jake, are you interested in Coutee as a potential entry point to this Deshaun Watson offense?
I like Coutee a lot. I actually have him inside my top 40, assuming Will Fuller's out. Like, I'll put Will Fuller back in if he. But the same thing. I did my rankings this week already with assuming Fuller's out, assuming Cobb's out, assuming Allison is out, like those type of situations, and I will adjust for them. So, as of now, assuming Fuller's out, as you said at the time of this recording, Coutee is a worthy start because it's not just what we saw last week. I know a lot of people are going to be overreactionary and all the yards and all the targets and all the receptions. But when you talk about the talent, and we were talking about in the preseason that he was pushing for slot work, that he was going to potentially make the first 3 on the opening day roster as in being the third option, it was his after-the-catch ability. We're talking about somebody who ranked inside the top 10 for not only that, but air yards as well, despite being outside the top 100 in big play passes targeted to him. So he's a big play guy. They're looking for ways to use him, as you said, giving him touches out of the backfield. They want to get the ball in his hands because he's very dangerous after the catch.
Yeah, and with Watson there, I could see this turning into, Watson's played pretty well. He shook off the rust after that first game. I could see, we'd seen situations. We talked about the Rams, all 3 guys producing. The Lions, all 3 guys have been able to produce. I think with no tight end production really coming from the Texans, I think 3 wide receivers could survive here. So I think Coutee, as much as he would be a great play this week if Fuller's out, I think he's a guy that you could potentially get excited about moving forward.
You know who Coutee is? Coutee is what everybody had always wanted Tavon Austin to be.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. He really is. Moving on Monday night, Washington is coming off a bye. They're heading to New Orleans. Potential shootout in the Dome there if Alex Smith can pull it off. Last week we didn't see the shootout materialize. We thought the Giants and the Saints had that potential. Never really got there. New Orleans offense tends to perform better in the Dome though, so there's a better chance I think that this one could turn into a shootout. Assuming that is the case, is there any value to be gleaned from the Washington side in this one? Chris Thompson, Jordan Reed, any of the receivers there, or maybe Adrian Peterson in the revenge game?
This kind of got to jump onto the next question. So the next question, I have a backup player because Jamison Crowder, I don't know why more people aren't excited for him this week because the worst part, and there's a lot of bad parts of their defense so far this year, it is nothing like we saw last season, but in the passing game, at least Lattimore can still do his job. Mostly, he's definitely not playing to the level he was last year, but you exposed the other 2 corners, and the one was they lost Patrick Robinson, and now P.J. Williams, who's just been god-awful, and that's why I had, Sterling Shepard, I never liked to have 100% ownership, but I had 100% ownership last week in DFS of Sterling Shepard. That's where you're looking for Jamison Crowder this week. Yes, he's only got 4 targets a game, but he did catch all 4 before the bye and did catch a touchdown. He's starting to get on pace with Alex Smith. The offense is starting to click. I think Richardson is a little intriguing, maybe for a big play, maybe for a touchdown of his own right. But I think Crowder should be, if you own Crowder and he's not in your lineup, I'd be very surprised this week. I don't know what kind of options you have where you can't start Crowder.
Yeah, I mean, the problem with Crowder is he's normally just such a boring play, but the opportunity is there this week.
You really kind of hate Jamison Crowder,
I
don't you?
kind of do. It's weird because he's never wronged me in any way. I've never started him and he let me down.
What did he do to you?
Yeah, he's never
I don't think he's
actually
that boring.
affected me.
I think he's kind of an interesting guy, interesting talent, but
maybe perhaps off the field. I don't know about interesting talent. He's an interesting player off the field, perhaps. We do this every week, Jake. Near the end of the podcast, we just talk about who is a player or maybe a couple players if you want that you think might be being overlooked in week 5.
Yeah, so there's the Jamison Crowder one was there. That was definitely one of them for me. I hate to say this because I have time and again said it looks like last year this guy fell off a cliff, hit every rock on the way down, and exploded at the bottom. But Jordy Nelson, the matchup this week, and there's another part of it where the Chargers push the pace in general, but even when they're tied or even when they have a lead, they're still pushing the pace. They have to be up by a lot to actually grind out the clock because that's just the way their offense works. We've seen it so far. But the thing is when you look at the Raiders, when they're down by a score or more, they really start to push the pace themselves. So it's more of potential numbers on the board, potential plays added on. Anytime you get more plays, you get more opportunities. And I don't like Jordy Nelson in general, but with this matchup with the potential to push the pace and get more opportunities, I think he's somebody that people aren't really interested in starting, but they would. And then on the other side of the ball, A lot of people don't want to start Mike Williams after what happened last week, but that's what you're going to have when you have 15 options on one team, is you're going to sometimes get left out of the mix. I think people are going to be too quick to react, just like they did with Corey Davis 2 weeks ago and didn't start him last week, even though a lot of people, including myself, said can keep him out there. I think Mike Williams, I'm looking at this game for a lot of value where people are probably not willing to start said value.
Absolutely. Woods, you're up.
All right, well, I feel a lot of pressure now because for this question, I think some of my picks this season haven't gone so great. I remember last week I said Kenyan Drake, this might be the week he finally gets some touches, and he certainly didn't get a lot of them.
Well, you predicted that Jared Goff 5 touchdown game, so
yeah,
we'll give you a pass.
Sure, okay, I'll claim that one as mine for last week.
But did you get Trubisky with 6? That's the big question.
If you count my preseason ranking, maybe, but certainly didn't call 6 touchdowns for week 4. I'm going to try to help out owners who are still searching for a tight end. It's just been so bad at the position. A few that I kind of like this week are playing against each other in the Steelers-Falcons game. I'll start with Vance McDonald on the Steelers. I mean, we know that the Falcons are without Dion Jones in their linebacking core. They're without Keanu Neal. They're without some other players on defense. I think they're vulnerable to a tight end, and the Steelers are starting to run Vance McDonald out on a bunch of pass routes, and he's looked kind of good. I don't like Austin Hooper on the Falcons as much, but I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think the Steelers have allowed the most receptions to tight ends this season. And, maybe they focus on Julio Jones, Calvin Ridley, and it opens things up a little bit for Austin Hooper. So those are 2 tight ends who I like more than I would in a normal week this week.
For me, we talked about Derrick Henry earlier. I think this is a winnable game for the Titans, and I think people are probably so disappointed with him that they might not want to trot him out into their lineup. I think you can this week. And if you want to go a little deeper, and maybe not as deep now because Mike McCarthy did come out and talk him up a little bit, but Marcus Valdes-Scantling, he's still out there in 99% of Yahoo leagues. I don't know how that's possible. Randall Cobb's banged up. Geronimo Allison's dealing with a concussion. He has big play potential. He showed it last week, a 38-yard catch. Unless both those other receivers are back healthy, and that doesn't seem to be the case here, he is a sneaky flex play this week. Now, before the season, I write, and Woods has participated in it in the past with me, I write an article about the players who are going to lead you to a title that season. We're 4 weeks in. We have a better handle on the landscape now. Some things have changed. Some things we might double down on. Let's look at one player at each position, and we can each make our pick. One player at each position that we think will be the key to taking fantasy owners to a title this season, given what we know now, what we know early in the year. Let's start with quarterback, and Jake, will let you go first.
Yeah, I tried to not go too obvious with most of them. And this one, I actually wrote up as like you're not your typical sleeper. But the fact is people still haven't completely jumped back on board with him, and that's Matt Ryan, because it's not just Matt Ryan. It's not just that this offense is starting to look similar to what it did 2 years ago. It's still behind that pace, but that was ridiculous. We all know that. But it's more so the fact that defense, which you just talked about, is awful. And then they're going to be in every single game where they're going to have to put up points. They're going to have to try to score because they're not winning a game 13-10 with that defense. So I'm also looking at Matt Ryan and looking at the rest of the schedule for the season. And maybe at Washington is concerning, and that's about it. I mean, he's on the road for 2 to 3 games in your fantasy playoffs, but it's at Green Bay, and a team's going to push the pace. It's going to be Green Bay, and they don't have a defense to stop them. Home against Arizona, and all they have is Patrick Peterson, and then at Carolina. So, I mean, maybe at Carolina worries you also a little bit, but I think Matt Ryan is going to carry some people, and I think you could buy, I'd say, high on him because of how good he's been, but that people are still doubting Matt Ryan.
Woods, who you got?
Yeah, I'm going to follow Jake's lead here. I'm going to try to call out some players who I think you could conceivably trade for. I mean, I'm not going to say Patrick Mahomes is going to lead you to a title, even though there's in high likelihood he will. But these are players who, they're good players. They won't necessarily be easy to trade for, but you could go and get. And for quarterback, I put down Jared Goff. I mean, Mahomes is getting all the publicity. The Chiefs' offense looks amazing. But I honestly might be even more impressed with the Rams' offense this season. They're just dictating so much right now. Defenses are so confused. You sort of watch the film. Linebackers don't know where to go. There's just so much pre-snap motion. At the snap, players are running every direction. And guys are just getting schemed wide open. And as we've seen for Goff, that's leading to some pretty big numbers. I mean, they just ripped apart the Vikings last week, and I expect more of that going forward. And they have a pretty easy schedule, too. You look at some of the matchups they have coming up. I don't know what the tough ones are. They're going at Seattle, that's extremely easy. Home to the Broncos, at the 49ers, home to the Packers, at the Saints, home to the Seahawks, home to the Chiefs, at the Lions. The tough one at the Bears, that's in fantasy semifinal week, I think, or quarterfinal week. But, man, the rest of that schedule sounds pretty good, and I think the Rams are just going to keep ripping it up. Jared Goff, I think you could easily acquire him right now. Wouldn't have to give up too much, and I think I sort of buy the Jared Goff might be MVP this season talk.
I'm not going to go with the guy that I think you necessarily would be able to trade for, but I am just going to go with the guy who I had early in the season, before the season, in this article, Deshaun Watson. Patrick Mahomes has stolen his buzz, basically. Patrick Mahomes is the Deshaun Watson of last year. Patrick Mahomes is doing that this year, and that's because Watson came into the season, wasn't as strong in that first game, but since then, he's done all right. Since then, he has the 4th most fantasy points among quarterbacks in the last 3 games. His schedule isn't menacing at all the rest of the way. He even gets to avoid the second game with the Jaguars because that's when it's tucked away in Week 17. And if you play in a fantasy championship in Week 17, please change that. Don't continue to do that to yourself. I really, really like this offense. We spoke about it a little bit when we talked about Coutee and Fuller. He also gets the Colts and the Jets in Week 14 and 15, and the Eagles in the fantasy championship. And we saw, they're tough against the run, but they're vulnerable to the pass. So give me Deshaun Watson. Let's go to running backs, and let's go back to Jake.
Yeah, this is definitely one I think you could trade for right now because a lot of people are concerned about him, and that's Dalvin Cook, because we all expected going into the season that he was going to be a little bit slow off the start because you got to keep him healthy for a team that has Super Bowl aspirations. And we all heard that. Well, obviously, getting an injury on top of that is not the best thing to see. But he's getting back. People are disappointed after last week. People are panicking. I'm seeing a lot of questions about him. But I'm also looking at weeks 15 and 16. And there's few opportunities that are better than facing Miami and Detroit for weeks 15 and 16 for your fantasy playoffs with the talent of Dalvin Cook. So if he's out there and you have a panicking owner, I am trading for him everywhere I can.
All right, I'll jump in here, and I'm going to give mine. And I wanted badly to say Kerryon Johnson. I think you know that, Boone. But as we discussed earlier, until the Lions start giving him more carries, I don't think I can do it. So I'm going to say Sony Michel. I mean, basically what we're looking for here is who is this year's Alvin Kamara, and it's setting up very nicely for that to be Michel. I mean, it's kind of following the same script. Kamara didn't do much through the first few weeks last season, and then as it happened, the depth chart opened up in front of him and suddenly had a bigger workload. That's what's happened for Michel with Rex Burkhead going on IR. I mean, he's really only battling James White for snaps right now, and the Patriots offense can support both of these guys. I mean, Michel, I think, is going to be the goal line back. He had 25 carries in Week 4, and we know this offense is going to score points, especially as they get Julian Edelman back, they get Josh Gordon integrated. I mean, this is the Patriots. We've seen some pretty bad running backs serve as their goal line back and score a ton of touchdowns, and I think Michel can be more than that. I mean, he showed in college he's a very good player. I think he can be a receiving back too, maybe not on the level of James White, but he can definitely contribute in that area. So that's a player who I think big things are coming for him.
Both great calls. What about Jordan Howard? And I know there's a lot of people that are down on Jordan Howard. He's a guy you can for sure trade for. I proved that this morning, Woods. I traded for him in our main league together. Everyone is worried after that game where Trubisky and the offense just dominated the Bucs and Howard only had 25 yards and no touchdowns. But you can't overreact to that. The way to attack Tampa is through the air. Trubisky took full advantage. The Bucs have given up the 7th most fantasy points to running backs, but a lot of that is touchdown based. They gave up 5 TDs to backs in the first 2 weeks. But from a rushing yard standpoint, they've held everyone in check. Kamara only had 29 yards on the ground against them. Ajayi and Clement combined for 53, and James Conner had 61 yards. Better days are ahead for Howard, and it starts with his schedule. 6 of his next 7 games are against weak teams that are weak against the run anyway. And that starts with 4 games against the AFC East coming off his Week 5 bye. If Trubisky can continue to build off the momentum of that last game, it'll take some of the pressure off of Howard. It's another boost for his production. I'm out there trying to get him in every league, not just ours, Woods. I'm out there trying to get him everywhere. Jake, wide receivers. Who is the wide receiver that is going to lead fantasy owners to a title in the second half of the year?
This is one I'm sticking with, and I'm so glad because I own so much of him, and hopefully everybody that listened to me does the same, because John Brown, For the
Nice.
rest of the season, I don't care. I'm not talking like a specific. The rest of the season has one non-plus matchup for wide receivers. The rest of the way, you got the Browns, the Titans, the Saints, the Carolina Panthers are the only non-plus one. Steelers are bye, and then check out the finish to the season after the bye. Bengals, Raiders, Falcons, Chiefs, Bucks, Chargers. John Brown is going to win people titles, especially because they got him for mid-round price, if even that, in their drafts. If you haven't already, this is one of those ones, like, to go back to Mac Ryan, you can buy high on John Brown. Like, you know, the person thinks they're selling high on him, but you go get him at that price anyway because it's going to be terrific production for the rest of the season.
Love that call. Woods, who's your receiver?
All right, well, I sort of have a wide receiver one who I think you can buy for a little bit less than that right now. I mean, the super elite guys like Julio Jones, Antonio Brown, Odell Beckham, none of them have had a great start to the season. You certainly wouldn't say they're ripping it up at like maximum efficiency, but I think they'd be too hard to trade for. But I think you could probably go out and get Keenan Allen, who's off to a pretty slow start. He only has one touchdown so far. He's only had one 100-yard receiving game. But you look at his last season, he was slow for the first 8 games of the season, basically, and then he ripped it up in the second half. I don't think you're going to have to wait for the whole first half of this season for that to happen for him again. Look at his next 4 games. Raiders, Browns, Titans, Seahawks. Those are some juicy matchups for a receiver. And the Chargers are good. That offense is very good. They're going to stay in the mix all season here. I expect Allen to really turn it on going forward.
Also a good one. I'm going to go with Devin Funchess here. He broke out last year with Greg Olsen sidelined. Since Olsen went down, Funchess had 7 catches for 77 yards in week 2, then at 67 yards and a score in week 3. Panthers were on bye last week, so he's kind of a forgotten man at this point, but he is the clear number 1 receiver for Cam Newton. And go look at his schedule. We're talking a lot about schedules here in the second half of the year. It's a little easier to predict now. 4 games in, we have a better idea of what defenses are bringing to the table. The second half of the year, Funchess gets the Buccaneers twice, Steelers, Seahawks, Saints, Falcons. It is smooth sailing from week 9 on for him. He's a solid wide receiver, too, the rest of the way, and someone I think people are probably still a little bit low on. Last position, tight end. Jake, help owners find the promised land.
And it's a miserable position this year. I mean, you know where I'm going. Again, I'm looking at the schedule long term. And there's a tight end who, after the bye, week 11 bye, by the way, for the final 5 games for our schedule, faces 5 of the 6 teams that I have in adjusted points allowed for fantasy tight ends. So 5 of the top 6 matchups for the final stretch run, because he also gets Cincinnati twice, and that's David Njoku, who's finally really starting to connect now that Baker Mayfield took over at quarterback. Like I said, it's Bengals, Texans, Panthers, Broncos, Bengals again for the last 5 games of the season. David Njoku should conceivably be a borderline top 5 tight end across those 5 games.
For this one, I sort of cheated, and I just wanted to look and say whoever's the last healthy tight end, because they're all getting hurt. There's going to be one last man standing at some point at this point. I mean, Olsen, Walker, Ingram, Eifert, Howard, so many guys. So I don't know. How about Kyle Rudolph? He hasn't missed a game in 3 years. Maybe he's the guy who's going to lead you to a title this season because he just doesn't get hurt.
It's possible. It's possible. I am going to go with someone that's way, way further down the list. Someone that Jake might be the all-in kid, but I'm going all in on this guy. I'm scooping him up everywhere. The Ravens love throwing to their tight ends. If you combine the volume of all their tight ends, the committee they've gone with, Nick Boyle, Mark Andrews, Max Williams, the tight ends are seeing a 23% target share in that offense. Hayden Hurst was their first-round pick. They had big expectations for him. They were going to use him a lot this year. I believe that. We've gotten hints that suggest that from some of the beat writers. He's almost healthy. He didn't get to play last week, but we're hoping that he's going to be able to play this week. And like you said, Woods, at a time when there's so many tight end injuries, at a time when there's not a lot of tight ends that are seeing heavy volume, I think Hayden Hurst can come in and turn that committee into a one-man show. Even if he's not getting top tier volume, he's going to be used a lot in that offense. And other than John Brown, they've been using Crabtree, but Crabtree's not the player he once was. So I'm out there stashing Hurst. I'm not going to throw him in my lineup if I don't have to yet. You can get him for the price of a cup of coffee at this point and then just see what happens. But if you're looking at someone on the waiver wire, somebody who could step in for you, I think Hayden Hurst is that guy. That's all we got today, folks. Jake, you crushed it, man. It just like old times, except we don't have you on video here, unfortunately, and we don't have your jerseys and everything in the background, but maybe next time.
Yeah, we'll get to that at some point.
It's great to catch up with you, man. I really appreciate you coming on. And I've said this before, and I know you don't like when I say it, but, Jake can come across as a little bit sarcastic sometimes, but don't let that demeanor fool you. He is one of the nicest guys in the industry.
No, don't ruin it. No, screw everybody listening. All you guys. I hate you all.
Make sure that you are following Jake on Twitter, as I mentioned, at AllenKid. Make sure you're checking out all his content at his new gig over at The Athletic. Woods and I are going to return on Sunday night for a full breakdown of the fantasy takeaways from Week 5, and we are going to give a first look at the waiver wire targets that you should be trying to pick up next week. If you want to get in touch with Woods, and if you want to see if that backyard wrestling video is still for sale somewhere out there, he's at David P. Woods on Twitter. Check the theScore app for all our fantasy content. You can get my rankings there, start sit advice, and much, much more. If you have any fantasy questions, I'll steal Jake's line. You can check the link for my rankings, but if the rankings don't answer it, then you can find me on Twitter at Justin Boone. Big thanks again to Jake. Big thanks to you for listening, and we will see you next time.
Said leave on time, my baby said